Did you know the ballpoint pen you used became popular because fighter pilots needed a pen that wouldn't leak at high altitudes? Or that the superglue in your drawer was discovered by accident by a scientist trying to make clear plastic gun sights? The world we live in is a ghost. It's haunted by a war that officially ended over 75 years ago. But it never really ended. Its echoes are in our technology, our politics, our borders, and even in our minds. We think we live in a time of peace, but we are living in the long, strange aftermath of the most destructive conflict in human history. How did a global war fought with propeller planes and infantrymen create the world of smartphones and international banking? Why do arguments that started in the 1940s still lead to conflicts today? And what if the most important legacies of that war are the ones we don't even see? Number 20, why are we so afraid of a bank collapse? The Great Depression wasn't just a backdrop to the war, it was one of its causes. When the world's economy fell apart in the 1930s, it created desperation. And desperate people often turn to extreme leaders who promise simple solutions to complex problems. The leaders who brought the world to war rose to power on the back of economic collapse. They promised jobs, stability, and national pride when people had none. So, when the war was finally winding down in 1944, the Allied leaders knew they couldn't just win the military victory. They had to win the economic peace. They had to build a system that would prevent the kind of economic catastrophe that led to the war in the first place. In July 1944, while battles still raged across Europe and the Pacific, delegates from 44 nations gathered at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They were there to design a new global economic order. The two main figures were John Maynard Keynes, a brilliant British economist, and Harry Dexter White, a senior U.S. Treasury official. They had different ideas, but they agreed on one thing: the pre-war system of floating exchange rates and protectionist trade policies had failed. It had led to a race to the bottom, where countries devalued their currencies to boost exports, creating instability and mistrust. The system they created, known as the Bretton Woods system, was revolutionary. It pegged all major world currencies to the US dollar, and the US dollar was pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. This created stability. A French franc or a British pound had a predictable value. This made international trade and investment much safer, but they did more than that. They created two powerful institutions that still shape our world. The first was the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. Its job was to be a sort of lender of last resort, providing short-term loans to countries struggling to keep their currency stable. It was a safety net to prevent a temporary problem from turning into a full-blown crisis. The second was the World Bank. Its initial job was to provide loans for rebuilding war-torn countries in Europe and Asia. Later, its mission expanded to funding development projects in poorer nations. For about 25 years, the Bretton Woods system worked. It fueled a period of incredible economic growth known as the post-war economic boom. But in 1971, the United States, struggling with the costs of the Vietnam War and domestic spending, broke the link between the dollar and gold. The system of fixed exchange rates collapsed, yet its children, the IMF and the World Bank, lived on, and they are more powerful than ever. Today, when a country like Greece or Argentina faces a debt crisis, it's the IMF that steps in with a bailout package. But those loans come with strings attached. The IMF often demands structural adjustments, which can mean deep cuts to government spending on things like healthcare and education. Its critics, like the economist Joseph Stiglitz, argue that these policies often hurt the poorest people and can make a crisis worse. The World Bank continues to fund massive infrastructure projects, but it too faces criticism for funding projects that displace local populations or harm the environment. Every time you hear about a global financial crisis, a debate over national debt, or a bailout for a struggling nation, you are hearing the echoes of Bretton Woods. The system designed to prevent the economic chaos that fueled one war has become a central and often controversial force in our modern globalized world. It's a permanent emergency brake on the global economy, built from the wreckage of the 1930s. But what if the stability they created was an illusion? What happens when the next global financial crisis is too big for the IMF to handle? Have these institutions become so powerful that they undermine the very sovereignty of the nations they were designed to help? And what hidden economic assumptions born in 1944 are we still living with, unable to see a different way forward? Number 19, who decides what a war crime is? Before the Second World War, the idea of putting the leaders of a defeated country on trial was almost unthinkable. War was seen as a political act, not a criminal one. You might execute a captured king or exile an emperor, but you didn't hold a systematic legal proceeding for crimes against peace. The winning side dictated the terms, and that was that. But the sheer scale and nature of the atrocities committed during the war changed everything. The world saw industrial-scale murder, the systematic targeting of civilians, and a complete disregard for any previously understood rules of warfare. When the war ended, the Allies were faced with a profound question: what do you do with the people responsible? The answer came in the form of a series of military tribunals held between 1945 and 1949. The most famous were held in a German city that had been the site of massive political rallies for the defeated regime. For the first time, high-ranking political and military leaders were charged not just with traditional war crimes like killing prisoners, but with new categories of offenses crimes against peace, which meant planning and waging an aggressive war, and crimes against humanity, which covered the systematic persecution and extermination of civilians. The lead prosecutor for the United States, Robert H. Jackson, a Supreme Court justice, made a powerful opening statement. He argued that these trials were not about revenge, but about establishing a legal precedent. He said, "The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated." This was a radical idea. It established the principle of individual responsibility. It meant that a person could not hide behind the defense of just following orders if those orders were illegal and immoral. The trials were controversial. Some called it victor's justice, arguing that the Allies were judging the Germans and Japanese for actions, like bombing cities, that they themselves had committed. But the legacy was profound. The principles developed at these trials laid the groundwork for modern international law. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, drew heavily from the concepts of human dignity that were at the heart of the crimes against humanity charge. The Genocide Convention of 1948 made the intentional destruction of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group a crime under international law. Today, this legacy lives on in institutions like the International Criminal Court (ICC) in The Hague. When you hear about a dictator or a warlord being put on trial for atrocities committed in places like the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, or Darfur, you are seeing the direct lineage of the post-war tribunals. The very concept that a head of state can be held accountable for their actions on an international stage is a direct result of the decisions made in 1945. But it's a complicated and often frustrating legacy. The ICC can only prosecute individuals from countries that have signed and ratified its treaty. Major world powers, including the United States, Russia, and China, have not. This creates a perception that international justice only applies to the weak, not the powerful. The idea that war has rules and that breaking them has legal consequences is now embedded in our global consciousness. It's a direct response to the horrors of a war that seem to have no rules at all, but it's a fragile idea, one that is constantly being tested by the realities of power politics. But who holds the victors accountable? If a powerful nation commits acts that would be considered war crimes if done by a smaller country, is there any real mechanism for justice? Has the creation of international law simply created a new kind of hypocrisy where justice is applied selectively? And what happens when a new form of warfare, like cyber attacks or autonomous drones, emerges that doesn't fit the definitions of crimes written in 1945? Number 18. Why did so many babies get born at once? For most of history, populations grew slowly. Wars, famines, and diseases kept numbers in check. But after the Second World War, something unprecedented happened in the United States and many other Western countries. A massive sustained surge in the birth rate. This was the baby boom. Between 1946 and 1964, 76 million babies were born in the U.S. alone. This wasn't just a little bump in the graph, it was a demographic explosion that reshaped society in ways we still feel every single day. Why did it happen? The most obvious reason was the end of the war itself. 16 million Americans had served in the military. Couples who had delayed marriage and children for years were finally reunited. There was a sense of optimism and economic prosperity. The war had pulled the U.S. out of the Great Depression. Factories that had been building tanks and planes were now building cars and washing machines. And the government gave a huge helping hand. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, universally known as the GI Bill, was one of the most transformative pieces of legislation in American history. It provided returning veterans with money for college, low-interest loans to buy homes, or start businesses. This combination of factors created the perfect conditions for a population boom. A new middle class emerged, flush with cash and optimism. They moved out of the cities and into newly built suburbs like Levittown, New York, where cookie-cutter houses were mass-produced on an assembly line, just like the bombers had been a few years earlier. These new suburban communities were designed for one thing: the nuclear family, a dad who commuted to work, a mom who stayed home, and a station wagon full of kids. This image, promoted endlessly on television shows like Leave It to Beaver, became the American ideal. The baby boomers, because of their sheer numbers, have defined American culture at every stage of their lives. In the 1950s, their childhood fueled the growth of the toy industry and the construction of new schools. In the 1960s and 70s, as teenagers and young adults, they drove the counterculture movement, the protests against the Vietnam War, and the rise of rock and roll. In the 1980s and 90s, as they entered their peak earning years, they drove the economy, consumer spending, and the stock market. Now, as they enter retirement, they are putting immense pressure on Social Security and Medicare, the social safety nets created in the 1930s. The debate today about the solvency of these programs is a direct consequence of the demographic bulge created after the war. Think about it. The houses we live in, the highways we drive on, the political divisions in our country, the music we listen to, so much of it was shaped by this one generation. This is the generation gap of the 60s, the rise of consumer culture, the current political power of older voters, all of it is a ripple effect from the end of the war. We are all living in a world built by and for the baby boomers. But what happens when that massive demographic bulge finally passes? Will the systems they built, from Social Security to the suburban housing market, be able to adapt? Are the cultural and political divisions they created permanent, or will they fade with time? And what demographic surprise, as unexpected as the baby boom, might be waiting for us in the future? Number 17, how did your grandparents afford a house? For many young people today, the idea of buying a house feels like a distant dream. Student debt is high, wages are stagnant, and housing prices in many cities are astronomical. But for a generation of Americans, the generation that came home from the war, home ownership became a reality for the first time. This wasn't an accident. It was a result of a deliberate government policy that fundamentally reshaped the American landscape and created the modern middle class. That policy was the GI Bill. Before the war, America was a nation of renters. Owning a home was for the wealthy. The banking system was also different. A typical mortgage required a down payment of 30 to 50% and had to be paid off in 5 to 10 years. It was a system that locked most working people out of the market. When the war ended, there was a huge fear among policymakers like President Franklin D. Roosevelt that the return of 16 million veterans to the workforce would trigger another Great Depression. They needed to do something to integrate these service members back into the economy. The GI Bill of 1944 was the answer. It was a sweeping piece of legislation. It offered veterans unemployment benefits, tuition for college or trade school, and most importantly, low interest, zero down payment home loans guaranteed by the federal government. This was a game changer. Suddenly, millions of young men who would have never been able to afford a home could now buy one. And developers like William Levitt stepped in to meet the demand using mass production techniques honed during the war. He built entire communities of affordable single-family homes in the suburbs. The American dream of a house with a white picket fence was born. Between 1944 and 1952, the Veterans Administration backed nearly 2.4 million home loans. This fueled a construction boom of epic proportions. It created jobs, stimulated the economy, and physically changed the country. Highways were built to connect these new suburbs to the cities, leading to the creation of the interstate highway system under President Eisenhower in 1956. This car-centric culture, the rise of shopping malls, and the decline of urban centers were all direct consequences of this post-war suburban explosion. For a generation of white Americans, the GI Bill was a ticket to prosperity and a cornerstone of the post-war American middle class. But there's a darker side to this story. The benefits of the GI Bill were not distributed equally. While the law itself was federally mandated, its implementation was left to local, white-run banks and VA offices. Through discriminatory practices known as redlining, these institutions often denied loans to black veterans. So while white GIs were buying homes in the suburbs and building generational wealth, many black GIs were shut out, confined to urban housing projects. This government-sponsored discrimination is a major reason for the persistent wealth gap between white and black Americans that exists today. A 2019 study from Brandeis University found that the racial wealth gap is now larger than it was in the 1960s. Much of that gap can be traced back to who was and was not able to buy a home after the war. So when we talk about the American middle class, the suburbs, or the racial wealth gap, we are talking about the legacy of the GI Bill. It was an engine of social mobility for some and a barrier for others, and its effects are still deeply inscribed on the geography and demography of our country. But how much of the prosperity of that era was built on a foundation of exclusion? If the GI Bill had been administered fairly, what would America look like today? And is it possible to create a similar engine of opportunity for today's generation without repeating the mistakes of the past? Number 16, are human rights a new idea? We talk about human rights as if they are a timeless, universal concept, but the idea that every single person, simply by virtue of being human, is entitled to certain fundamental rights is actually a very modern invention, and it was born directly out of the ashes of the Second World War. Before the war, the prevailing idea was national sovereignty. How a government treated its own citizens was its own business. There was no international standard for how a country should behave toward its own people. Other nations had no right to interfere. The war completely shattered that idea. The world watched in horror as the German regime and its allies engaged in the systematic persecution and mass murder of millions of its own citizens and people in the territories it conquered. They targeted Jews, Romani people, homosexuals, disabled people, and political opponents. This wasn't just a byproduct of war, it was a central ideological goal of the regime. When the concentration and extermination camps were liberated in 1945, the soldiers and journalists who saw them were confronted with a level of organized cruelty that was almost beyond comprehension. The photographs and newsreels that emerged from places like Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen showed piles of emaciated bodies and skeletal survivors. It became clear that the old idea of national sovereignty was not enough. It could be used as a shield to commit unimaginable atrocities. In response to this, a new movement was born. The goal was to create a set of universal standards that would apply to all people in all nations, a moral and legal code that would transcend national borders. The newly formed United Nations became the forum for this effort. A committee was formed, chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, the former First Lady of the United States. It included members from around the world, like Charles Malik from Lebanon and Peng Chun-Chang from China. Their task was to draft a document that would define the fundamental rights and freedoms of all people. The result, adopted by the UN General Assembly on December 10, 1948, was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights UDHR. It begins with the powerful statement, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. The 30 articles that follow lay out a wide range of rights: the right to life, the prohibition of slavery and torture, the right to a fair trial, freedom of speech and religion, the right to education, and the right to work. The UDHR is not a legally binding treaty. It's a declaration, a statement of principles, but it has become the foundation of modern international human rights law. It has inspired the constitutions of dozens of new nations and has been the basis for numerous international treaties like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Today, when organizations like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch campaign for the release of political prisoners, or when governments impose sanctions on a country for its human rights record, they are acting on the principles laid out in the UDHR. The very language we use to talk about justice and dignity is shaped by this document. It was a direct and profound rejection of the ideologies that had plunged the world into war, an attempt to build a global consensus around the inherent worth of every individual. But what happens when a powerful nation violates these rights? Is a declaration enough to stop a government determined to oppress its people? Have the principles of human rights become a tool used by Western countries to impose their values on others? And in a world with so many different cultures and beliefs, can we ever truly agree on what it means to be human? Number 15, why can't we get rid of a dictator? Before 1945, the world was a collection of empires. Great Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Portugal controlled vast territories across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The war was fought, in part, to defend these empires from the aggression of Germany, Italy, and Japan, who wanted to build their own. But in a strange twist of history, the victory of the Allied powers led directly to the collapse of their own empires. The war that was fought to preserve the old world order ended up destroying it. How did this happen? First, the war shattered the myth of European invincibility. The rapid fall of Singapore to the Japanese in 1942, for example, was a huge psychological blow to the British Empire. People in colonized nations saw that their European masters could be defeated. Second, the war exhausted the European powers. They were economically devastated and lacked the military resources and the political will to maintain control over their vast restive colonies. Third, the war's rhetoric of freedom and self-determination was turned back against the colonizers. Leaders of independence movements like Mahatma Gandhi in India and Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam pointed out the hypocrisy of fighting a war for freedom while denying it to millions of people in their own empires. The two new superpowers that emerged from the war, the United States and the Soviet Union, were both, for their own reasons, opposed to the old European colonial system. The US saw it as a relic of the past that hindered free trade. The Soviet Union saw it as a form of capitalist exploitation and supported anti-colonial movements as a way to spread its own influence. This pressure from both the top down the superpowers and the bottom-up independence movements created a perfect storm. The process of decolonization happened with incredible speed. In 1947, Britain granted independence to India and Pakistan. This triggered a wave of independence movements across the globe. Over the next 2 decades, dozens of new countries were born in Asia and Africa. But this process was often chaotic and violent. The new borders, often drawn by the departing colonial powers with little regard for existing ethnic or religious divisions, created lasting conflicts. The partition of India, for example, led to the displacement of over 10 million people and the deaths of up to 2 million. In Africa, the legacy of arbitrarily drawn borders has fueled civil wars and ethnic conflicts that continue to this day. Conflict in Rwanda in the 1990s, for instance, had deep roots in the way the Belgian colonial administration had favored one ethnic group over another. And the end of formal empire did not mean the end of foreign influence. The Cold War turned many of these newly independent nations into proxy battlegrounds for the US and the Soviet Union. Both superpowers propped up friendly dictators and armed rebel groups, prolonging conflicts and undermining democratic development. The political instability, the civil wars, and the struggles for democracy that we see in many parts of the developing world are not just internal problems. They are the long, painful aftershocks of the sudden and violent collapse of the colonial world order, a collapse that was set in motion by the Second World War. But did decolonization simply replace one form of control with another? Have former colonies ever truly become independent, or are they still subject to the economic and political power of their former rulers? And what responsibility do the former colonial powers have for the conflicts and poverty that their legacy has created? Number 14. Is there a permanent war machine? Before the Second World War, the United States had a relatively small standing army. When war broke out, the country would mobilize. The factories would be converted to military production. When the war was over, the army would demobilize, and the factories would go back to making consumer goods. That all changed after 1945. The war ended, but the massive military establishment that was built to fight it never went away. It became a permanent feature of American society, creating what President Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his farewell address in 1961, famously called the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower was no dove. He was a 5-star general who had been the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe. But he saw a danger in the new reality that the war had created. The war had fused together the military, private industry, and the government in an unprecedented way. Scientists and universities developed new weapon systems under government contracts. Corporations like Boeing and Lockheed, which had built planes for the war, now had a permanent, lucrative customer in the Department of Defense. And politicians, eager to bring jobs to their districts, competed to secure military bases and defense contracts. This created a powerful triangle of interests. The military wanted the latest and best weapons. The defense industry wanted to sell those weapons. And politicians wanted the economic benefits that came with military spending. Eisenhower warned that this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. He worried that its total influences economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. He feared that public policy could become the captive of a scientific technological elite. His warning was prophetic. The Cold War with the Soviet Union provided the justification for keeping this complex running at full steam for decades. The US engaged in a massive arms race, building thousands of nuclear weapons, a huge navy, and an air force of advanced bombers and fighter jets. Even after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the military-industrial complex didn't shrink. It found new justifications for its existence, from the war on terror to competition with new global rivals. Today, the United States spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined. That spending has a huge impact on our economy and our politics. It drives technological innovation, creating things that spill over into the civilian world like the internet and GPS. But it also diverts enormous resources that could be used for other priorities like healthcare, education, or infrastructure. It gives the defense industry immense lobbying power in Washington, and it creates a powerful momentum in favor of military solutions to foreign policy problems. When you have the world's most powerful hammer, every problem can start to look like a nail. The permanent state of military readiness that we now take for granted is a direct legacy of the Second World War. The war created a machine that was too big, too powerful, and too economically important to ever be shut down. But is Eisenhower's warning still relevant today? Or is a powerful military-industrial complex a necessary evil in a dangerous world? How much of our foreign policy is driven by genuine security threats, and how much is driven by the need to feed this massive machine? And what would it take to actually dismantle it, or is it now simply too big to fail? Number 13, why is Israel there? The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is one of the most intractable and emotionally charged conflicts in the world. It dominates headlines and fuels political debates across the globe. But to understand its origins, you have to go back to the Second World War. The war didn't create the idea of a Jewish state known as Zionism, which had been around since the late 19th century. But the war turned that idea from a political aspiration into an urgent global necessity in the eyes of many. During the war, the German regime and its collaborators carried out the systematic industrial-scale murder of approximately 6 million European Jews. This event, a horror of unparalleled scale, had a profound impact on the international community and on Jewish people worldwide. For many, it was the ultimate tragic proof that Jewish people would never be safe as a minority in other nations. The only way to guarantee their survival, they argued, was to have a state of their own. At the same time, the war weakened the British Empire, which had been controlling the territory of Palestine under a mandate from the League of Nations since the end of the First World War. Britain had made conflicting promises to both the Arabs and the Jews. It was facing increasing pressure from both sides, as well as violent resistance from Jewish militant groups. Exhausted and nearly bankrupt after the war, Britain decided to hand the problem over to the newly created United Nations. In 1947, the UN voted to partition Palestine into 2 states, one Arab and one Jewish, with Jerusalem as an international city. The Jewish leadership accepted the plan, but the Arab states and the Palestinian Arab leadership rejected it. They saw it as the theft of their land by European colonialists. On May 14, 1948, the British mandate expired. David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, declared the establishment of the State of Israel. Immediately, the neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, invaded. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War had begun. The Israelis won that war, and in the process, they expanded their territory beyond the UN partition plan's borders. For Israelis, it was a war of independence and survival. For Palestinians, it was the Nakba, or the catastrophe. More than 700,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes and became refugees. This event is the original sin of the conflict, a wound that has never healed. The refugee camps that were set up in 1948 still exist today, their populations having grown over generations. Every major event in the region since then, the Six-Day War in 1967, the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, the rise of the Palestine Liberation Organization PLO, the 2 intifadas, the growth of settlements, the building of the separation barrier, the rise of Hamas is a direct consequence of the unresolved questions from 1948. The war in Europe created the political will and the desperate urgency for the creation of a Jewish state. But in doing so, it also created a new and lasting conflict, displacing one people to provide a sanctuary for another. The trauma of one historical catastrophe became the seed of another. But was there ever a solution that could have accommodated the rights and aspirations of both peoples? What if the UN had proposed a different plan? Or if the Arab states had accepted the 1947 partition? And is it possible for two peoples with such deeply intertwined and painful histories to ever find a way to share the same small piece of land? Number 12. Why is a woman's place in the... A married woman working outside the home was often seen as a sign that her husband couldn't support the family. The war completely upended these social norms, not because of a sudden wave of feminist ideology, but out of sheer necessity. When millions of men went off to fight, someone had to keep the factories running. The country needed workers to build the planes, tanks, ships, and guns that would win the war. The government launched a massive propaganda campaign to persuade women to enter the workforce. The most famous symbol of this campaign was Rosie the Riveter, a fictional character who appeared on posters and in magazines, flexing her bicep under the slogan, "We can do it." The message was clear. It was a woman's patriotic duty to take a job in a defense plant, and they responded in huge numbers. Between 1940 and 1945, the female labor force grew by over 50%. More than 6 million women took jobs. For the first time, large numbers of married women, including mothers, went to work. They became welders, riveters, and electricians. They did jobs that had always been considered men's work, and they proved they could do them just as well. This experience was transformative for many women. It gave them a sense of independence, competence, and their own paycheck. A 1944 study by the Women's Bureau found that the vast majority of women who had taken war jobs wanted to keep working after the war was over. But when the men came home, the old expectations returned. The government and media that had once praised Rosie now told women that their patriotic duty was to go back to the kitchen and make room for the returning veterans. Many women were laid off from their factory jobs, but the door, once opened, could not be completely closed. The war had planted a seed. It had shown that women were capable of doing far more than society had allowed. The image of the happy 1950s housewife was, in many ways, a reaction against the independence that women had experienced during the war. The daughters of the Rosie the Riveter generation, the baby boomers, grew up with a different set of expectations. They saw what their mothers had done. This experience helped fuel the second wave feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s. The books, like Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, 1963, gave voice to the dissatisfaction of many suburban housewives who felt trapped and unfulfilled. The fight for equal pay, access to education, and reproductive rights was built on the foundation laid by the women who had entered the workforce during the war. Today, women make up almost half of the American workforce. The debates we have about paid family leave, affordable childcare, and the gender pay gap are all direct descendants of the massive social experiment that took place during the war. It was a temporary change born of crisis, but it permanently altered our understanding of work, family, and the role of women in society. But if the war proved women could do men's work, why did it take so long for them to gain even partial equality in the workplace? How much of the 1950s ideal of the stay-at-home mom was a deliberate attempt to push back against the social changes the war had created? And are we still dealing with the unresolved tension between the working woman and the traditional family structure that the war brought to the surface? Number 11. Who invented the superhighway? If you've ever driven across the United States on a long road trip, you've spent most of your time on the interstate highway system. It's a 48,000-mile network of massive multi-lane highways that connects every major city in the country. We take it for granted, but it's one of the largest public works projects in human history, and its origins lie in the mud and dust of the Second World War. The man most responsible for the interstate system was Dwight D. Eisenhower. In 1919, long before he was a general or a president, a young Major Eisenhower took part in the U.S. Army's first transcontinental motor convoy. The goal was to see how quickly the military could move troops and supplies from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. The trip was a disaster. It took 62 days. The roads were terrible, a patchwork of poorly maintained dirt tracks and narrow lanes. All vehicles got stuck in mud and sand, and bridges collapsed. The experience stuck with Eisenhower. Years later, during the Second World War, Eisenhower was the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe. He was responsible for the logistics of moving millions of soldiers and millions of tons of equipment. He got a first-hand look at a very different kind of road system. the German Autobahn. Started in the 1930s by the regime in power, the Autobahn was a network of high-speed, limited-access highways. Eisenhower was incredibly impressed. He saw how efficiently it could be used to move military convoys. He also saw its potential for national defense. In an emergency, such a system could be used to evacuate cities or rapidly deploy troops. When he became president in 1953, building a similar system in the United States became one of his top domestic priorities. He sold the idea to Congress and the public not as a convenience for motorists, but as a matter of national security. The official name of the law he signed in 1956 was the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act. The Cold War was in full swing, and the fear of a nuclear attack was very real. The highways were designed with military needs in mind. The overpasses were built high enough to allow military vehicles to pass underneath. 1 in every 5 miles was supposed to be straight enough to be used as an emergency landing strip for aircraft, though this feature was rarely implemented. The construction of the interstate system had a profound and lasting impact on America. It made travel by car fast, easy, and safe, which led to the decline of passenger rail. It fueled the growth of the suburbs, as people could now live farther from their jobs in the city. It created a whole new culture of trucking, motels, fast food restaurants, and roadside attractions. It physically unified the country in a way it had never been before, but it also had a dark side. In many cities, the new highways were routed directly through vibrant black neighborhoods, destroying communities, displacing residents, and creating physical barriers that reinforced segregation. A 2021 study by the U.S. Public Interest Research Group found numerous examples of this, calling the highways a story of racism and inequality. So every time you merge onto an on-ramp, you are using a piece of infrastructure that was inspired by a German military project and sold to the American public as a Cold War defense measure. It's a ribbon of concrete that ties the modern American landscape directly to the battlefields of Europe. But what did we lose when we chose the car over the train? How many communities were sacrificed for the sake of high-speed travel? And could the massive effort that built the highways ever be replicated to build a new, more sustainable transportation system for the 21st century? Number 10. Why does the U.S. run the world? Before the Second World War, the United States was a reluctant global power. After the First World War, it had retreated into isolationism, refusing to join the League of Nations and trying to stay out of Europe's conflicts. The war changed that permanently. It didn't just make the United States a major player on the world stage, it made it the dominant player. The world we live in today, with its American military bases, the dollar as the global reserve currency, and American culture everywhere, is a direct result of the war's outcome. The war accomplished this in 2 ways. It built up the United States while tearing down everyone else. For the U.S., the war was a massive economic stimulus. While other major industrial powers were being bombed into rubble, American factories were running 24/7, safe from attack. The country's industrial capacity doubled during the war. It produced a staggering amount of military hardware: 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and 12.5 million rifles. At the end of the war, the U.S. economy was larger than all the other major powers combined. It held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, and it was the only country with the atomic bomb. Meanwhile, the old powers of Europe were devastated. And Great Britain was victorious but bankrupt. France had been occupied and humiliated. Germany and Japan were in ruins. The Soviet Union had suffered unimaginable losses, with over 25 million of its citizens killed. It was a military giant, but an economic wreck. This left a massive power vacuum in the world, and the United States was the only nation with the economic and military strength to fill it. The U.S. stepped into this role with programs like the Marshall Plan. Announced by Secretary of State George Marshall in 1947, the plan provided massive amounts of economic aid, over $13 billion, the equivalent of over $150 billion today, to help rebuild Western Europe. On the surface, it was an act of generosity, but it was also a brilliant strategic move. It helped create stable, democratic governments that would be allies against the Soviet Union. It also created new markets for American goods, ensuring the continued prosperity of the U.S. economy. At the same time, the U.S. built a network of military alliances, like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, established in 1949, which placed American troops permanently in Europe. This was the beginning of the American century. For the next 75 years, the United States would be the undisputed leader of the Western world, the guarantor of international security, and the engine of the global economy. The institutions that govern the world today, like the United Nations headquartered in New York, the World Bank, and the IMF, both headquartered in Washington, D.C., were largely American designs created to promote a world order favorable to American interests. The Pax Americana, or American peace, that has characterized the post-war era, a period with no direct wars between major powers, has been underwritten by American military and economic dominance. But this dominance is now being challenged. The rise of China, a resurgent Russia, and the growing economic power of other nations are leading to a more multipolar world. The debates we have today about America's role in the world are debates about the future of a global order that was born from the ashes of the Second World War. Was the American-led order a benevolent system that promoted peace and prosperity, or was it a new form of empire? How much of the world's resentment towards the United States is a reaction to the power it gained from the war? And what will the world look like if, or when, the American century finally comes to an end? Number 9, what is your computer's secret origin? We think of the computer revolution as something that started in a garage in Silicon Valley with people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. But the real origins of the modern computer go back to a secret war fought not with bullets, but with mathematics, in quiet country houses and hidden research labs during the Second World War. The first electronic computers were not built to play games or browse the web. They were built for one purpose: to break enemy codes. During the war, one of the biggest challenges for the Allies was breaking the sophisticated encryption used by the German military. Their most famous cipher machine, known as Enigma, was an electromechanical device that could scramble messages into a seemingly random string of letters. The Germans believed it was unbreakable. Breaking these codes was a top priority. A British team of mathematicians, linguists, and engineers was assembled at a secret facility called Bletchley Park. Among them was a brilliant, eccentric mathematician named Alan Turing. Turing and his colleagues realized that breaking the Enigma ciphers by hand was impossible. The number of possible combinations was astronomical. They needed a machine to fight a machine. They designed and built a series of devices called bombs, which were electromechanical machines that could rapidly test thousands of possible Enigma settings. But even these were not enough for the more complex ciphers used by the German High Command, so they built something even more ambitious: Colossus. Completed in 1943, Colossus was the world's first programmable electronic digital computer. It used hundreds of vacuum tubes, was the size of a room, and was used to decipher the messages of the German Lorenz cipher. The information gained from these code-breaking efforts, known as Ultra, was incredibly valuable. Historians believe it may have shortened the war by as much as 2 years and saved millions of lives. At the same time, in the United States, similar work was being done. At the University of Pennsylvania, physicists John Mauchly and J. Presper Eckert were building a machine called ENIAC, Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, to calculate artillery firing tables for the U.S. Army. Like Colossus, it was a massive machine filled with vacuum tubes. Completed in 1945, it was too late to be used in the war, but it was the first general-purpose electronic computer. After the war, many of the scientists who worked on these secret projects, like John von Neumann, went on to lay the theoretical foundations for the computers we use today. The von Neumann architecture, which separates the computer's memory from its processing unit, is still the basis for almost every computer, from a supercomputer to the smartphone in your pocket. Because of the secrecies surrounding projects like Colossus, which remained classified for decades, the story of the computer's wartime origins was not well known for a long time. But the war created the urgency and provided the funding to take computing from a theoretical concept to a practical reality. It was a crash course in electronic engineering and logical design. The need to solve complex wartime problems, from breaking codes to calculating bomb trajectories, was the catalyst that sparked the digital age. What other technological breakthroughs from the war might still be classified? If the war hadn't happened, how long would it have taken to invent the computer? And does the fact that modern computing was born from the needs of warfare and espionage tell us something fundamental about the nature of the technology itself? Number 8. Have we created a weapon that will inevitably destroy us? The Second World War began with cavalry charges in Poland and ended with a mushroom cloud over Japan. In just 6 years, the nature of warfare and the future of humanity was changed forever. The war's final act was the unveiling of the most terrifying weapon ever created, the atomic bomb. And with its creation, we entered a new and precarious era, the nuclear age. We have been living in it ever since. The story of the bomb's creation is a story of scientific genius, moral compromise, and geopolitical fear. In 1939, a group of scientists, including Albert Einstein, wrote a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. They warned him that recent discoveries in nuclear physics made it possible to create a new type of bomb of unimaginable power. And they were afraid that scientists in Germany were already working on one. This fear spurred the creation of the Manhattan Project, a top-secret U.S. program to build an atomic bomb before the enemy could. The project was a massive undertaking, employing over 130,000 people and costing billions of dollars. The scientific director was a brilliant and charismatic physicist named J. Robert Oppenheimer. He assembled a team of the world's top scientists in a remote laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico. On July 16, 1945, they tested their creation in the desert. The test, codenamed Trinity, was a terrifying success. Oppenheimer, watching the fireball light up the pre-dawn sky, later recalled a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Less than a month later, on August 6th and 9, 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bombs killed over 200,000 people, mostly civilians, and forced Japan's surrender, ending the war. But it also opened a Pandora's box. The world now knew that such a weapon was possible. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb, and the nuclear arms race began. For the next 40 years, the Cold War between the US and the USSR was defined by the nuclear threat. Both sides built up massive arsenals, each capable of destroying the other many times over. This led to the chillingly logical doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The idea was that any nuclear attack would be met with a devastating counterattack, ensuring the annihilation of both sides. This balance of terror prevented a direct war between the superpowers, but it brought the world to the brink of catastrophe on several occasions, most famously during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Today, the Cold War is over, but the nuclear threat remains. The club of nuclear powers has expanded to include countries like China, Britain, France, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. The fear of nuclear proliferation, the spread of these weapons to more countries or even to terrorist groups, is a constant concern. And the technology that was born in the Manhattan Project also gave us nuclear power, a source of clean energy that also carries the risk of catastrophic accidents like Chernobyl in 1986 and Fukushima in 2011. We live in a world permanently shadowed by the knowledge of how to split the atom. It's a knowledge that was unleashed by the war, and one we can never take back. How many times have we come close to accidental nuclear war due to technical glitches or human error? Is it realistic to believe that these weapons will never be used again? And what does it do to us psychologically to live on a planet where we have the means to cause our own extinction at any moment? Number 7, why do we fly in jets? If you've ever flown on a commercial airplane, you have the Second World War to thank for the jet engine that propelled you across the sky. Before the war, aviation was dominated by propeller-driven aircraft. They were loud, they vibrated, and they were limited in speed and altitude. The idea of jet propulsion, of using a stream of hot gas to push an aircraft forward, had been around for a while, but it was the urgent demands of the war that turned it from a theoretical concept into a practical, world-changing technology. The race to build the first jet fighter was a secret, high-stakes competition. 2 engineers working completely independently in different countries were the pioneers. In Britain, a Royal Air Force officer named Frank Whittle patented his design for a turbojet engine in 1930, but he struggled for years to get funding and support. In Germany, a young physicist named Hans von Ohain developed his own jet engine design in the mid-1930s. The German government, however, saw the military potential of his work and funded it heavily. As a result, the world's first jet-powered aircraft, the Heinkel Need He-178, made its first flight in Germany in August 1939, just days before the invasion of Poland. During the war, both sides scrambled to develop operational jet fighters. Germany was the first to succeed, introducing the Messerschmitt Me 262 into combat in 1944. It was a revolutionary aircraft, hundreds of miles per hour faster than any Allied propeller plane. It was a shock to Allied pilots who encountered it. Britain followed with its own jet, the Gloucester Meteor. The United States, lagging behind, developed the P-80 Shooting Star, which arrived just as the war in Europe was ending. These first jets were unreliable and had a limited impact on the outcome of the war, but they were a glimpse of the future. After the war, the jet engine transformed both military and civilian aviation. The Korean War in the early 1950s was the first major conflict where jet fighters, like the American F-86 Sabre and the Soviet MiG-15, fought each other in the skies. The technology developed for these military jets was quickly adapted for civilian use. In 1952, the British de Havilland Comet became the world's first commercial jet airliner. It was a sensation. It could fly higher and faster than any propeller plane, offering a smoother, quieter ride. Despite early setbacks due to design flaws, the jet age had begun. In 1958, Pan American World Airways began transatlantic service with the Boeing 707, and the world suddenly became a much smaller place. A trip from New York to London that once took 14 hours in a propeller plane could now be done in under 7. The jet engine made mass air travel possible. It opened up the world to tourism and business, connected cultures, and fueled globalization. The globalized world we live in, where you can have breakfast in one continent and dinner in another, is built on the foundation of a technology that was rushed into existence by the desperate needs of war. But what if the development of the jet engine had been delayed by a decade? How different would our modern, interconnected world be? Did the speed of air travel create a false sense of global community while masking deep-seated cultural divisions? And as we confront the environmental costs of air travel, will the jet engine, once a symbol of progress, become a symbol of our failure to live sustainably? Number 6, how did we cure so many diseases so quickly? War is a paradox. It is the ultimate act of destruction, but it can also be a powerful catalyst for innovation, especially in medicine. The sheer number of casualties and the urgent need to treat them on a massive scale forces doctors and scientists to find new and better ways to save lives. The Second World War was a turning point for medicine. Many of the treatments and techniques that we consider standard today were either invented or perfected on the battlefields and in the military hospitals of the 1940s. Perhaps the most important medical legacy of the war was the mass production of penicillin. The antibiotic properties of the penicillium mold had been discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, but he was unable to produce it in a stable, usable form. It remained a laboratory curiosity for over a decade. The war changed that. With soldiers dying from infected wounds that would have been treatable with an effective antibiotic, the US and British governments made penicillin production a top priority. They launched a massive research effort involving government labs, universities, and pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer. Scientists developed new methods for growing the mold in large vats and for purifying the drug. By 1944, they were producing enough penicillin to treat all the Allied wounded. It was a miracle drug, dramatically reducing deaths from bacterial infections and amputations. After the war, it became available to the public, launching the age of antibiotics and saving hundreds of millions of lives. Another major advance was in blood transfusion and storage. The ability to give blood to wounded soldiers was critical, but whole blood is perishable. A Harvard surgeon named Charles R. Drew revolutionized the process. He discovered that plasma, the liquid component of blood wheat, could be separated, dried, and stored for much longer than whole blood. It could then be reconstituted with water and given to any patient, regardless of their blood type. Drew organized the Blood for Britain program and later the first American Red Cross blood bank, creating the system of mass blood donation and storage that we still use today. His work saved countless lives on the battlefield and created the foundation for modern emergency medicine. The war also spurred advances in surgery, particularly plastic surgery, and neurosurgery. Doctors had to treat horrific new types of injuries from burns, shrapnel, and high-explosive shells. Surgeons like Archibald McIndoe in Britain developed pioneering techniques to rebuild the faces and hands of burned pilots. The sheer volume of head injuries led to a better understanding of the brain and new surgical procedures. Beyond physical injuries, the war also forced a recognition of the psychological trauma of combat. The term shell shock from the First World War was replaced by combat fatigue. While the understanding was still limited, it was an early step towards the modern concept of post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD). From the flu shot you get every year, the first effective flu vaccine was developed for U.S. troops during the war to the emergency care. You would receive in a hospital. The fingerprints of the Second World War are all over modern medicine. It was a brutal, real-world laboratory that accelerated the pace of medical discovery by decades. But did our reliance on antibiotics, born from the war, lead to the current crisis of antibiotic-resistant bacteria? How many medical breakthroughs were made by doctors from the Axis powers who conducted unethical experiments on prisoners? And has the military-style, crisis-driven approach to medicine that the war created made us better at treating acute injuries but worse at preventing chronic disease? Number 5. Why do we trust the weatherman? Predicting the weather has always been a human obsession. For most of history, it was a mix of folklore and guesswork. But accurate, large-scale weather forecasting is a modern science, and like so many other modern sciences, it took a giant leap forward during the Second World War. For military planners, the weather was not a small-talk topic, it was a matter of life and death. The success or failure of a bombing raid, a naval battle, or an amphibious invasion could depend entirely on a sudden change in the wind, a bank of fog, or an unexpected storm. Before the war, weather forecasting was a relatively primitive affair. Forecasters relied on reports from weather stations on land and a few ships at sea. The data was sparse, and the forecasts were often unreliable for more than a day in advance. The war created an urgent need for much better forecasting. You couldn't plan a massive operation like the D-Day landings without having the best possible information about the weather over the English Channel. Both the Allied and Axis powers poured resources into meteorology. They set up new weather stations in remote locations, launched weather balloons to gather data from the upper atmosphere, and put meteorologists on naval ships and long-range reconnaissance aircraft. This created a flood of new data, and they needed new ways to analyze it. A Norwegian physicist named Wilhelm Bjerknes had earlier developed the concept of air masses and fronts, which is the basis of modern meteorology. His ideas were now put into practice on a global scale. Meteorologists began to understand the large-scale patterns of the atmosphere, like the jet stream, a high-altitude river of wind that has a huge impact on weather systems. The need to predict weather for aviation, in particular, pushed the science forward. But the biggest breakthrough came from the need to solve complex mathematical equations. A British mathematician named Lewis Fry Richardson had proposed in the 1920s that weather could be predicted by solving a series of differential equations that describe the physics of the atmosphere. But the calculations were so complex that it would take a human calculator weeks to produce a single 24-hour forecast by which time the weather had already happened. The wartime development of the first electronic computers, like ENIAC, finally provided a tool that was fast enough to do these calculations. After the war, scientists like John von Neumann used these new computers to create the first numerical weather prediction models. This was the birth of modern forecasting. The weather map you see on the evening news, with its high and low pressure systems and moving fronts, is a direct descendant of the maps used to plan bombing raids over Europe. The satellite images and sophisticated computer models that allow for 5 or 7 day forecasts are the legacy of the wartime marriage of meteorology and computing. The war transformed weather forecasting from an art into a science, driven by data and computational power. But with sensitive weather data, crucial for military operations, is still kept secret from the public. How has the military's ability to weaponize the weather, through techniques like cloud seeding, evolved since the war? And in an age of climate change, are the forecasting models developed for short-term military needs adequate for predicting the long-term chaotic behavior of our planet's climate system? Number 4, how can a country disappear? Look at a map of the world from 1938. Now look at a map from today. Many of the borders are different, where countries have appeared, disappeared, or been split in two. The political map of the world that we take for granted was not carved in stone. It was largely drawn and redrawn by the victors of the Second World War. The lines on our maps are, in many cases, scars from that conflict. The most dramatic changes happened in Europe. Germany was partitioned. The Allied powers, each the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, divided the defeated country into 4 occupation zones. The capital, Berlin, located deep inside the Soviet zone, was also divided. This temporary arrangement became permanent as the Cold War set in. In 1949, the Western zones became the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and the Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. For the next 40 years, Germany was 2 countries, separated by an Iron Curtain that became a physical wall in Berlin. The reunification of Germany in 1990 was, in a very real sense, the final act of the Second World War in Europe. The borders of Poland were also completely redrawn. The country was effectively picked up and moved west. the Soviet Union kept the parts of eastern Poland that it had occupied in 1939. To compensate Poland, the Allies gave it large areas of former German territory. This led to one of the largest forced migrations in history, as millions of Germans were expelled from these recovered territories and millions of Poles were moved in. Other countries in Eastern Europe, like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, were brought under the domination of the Soviet Union, their fates decided at conferences like the one in Yalta in February 1945, where Allied leaders essentially carved Europe into spheres of influence. The war's end also had a profound impact on the map of Asia. The most lasting legacy was the division of Korea. After Japan's surrender, the Soviet Union occupied the northern half of the Korean peninsula, and the United States occupied the southern half. As in Germany, this temporary division became permanent. In 1948, two separate states were established, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, and the Republic of Korea, South Korea. The Korean War 1950-53 solidified this division, creating one of the most heavily militarized and dangerous borders in the world. The ongoing tension on the Korean Peninsula, with its nuclear-armed North and US-backed South, is a frozen conflict, a direct, unresolved legacy of decisions made in 1945. Even the borders of the Soviet Union itself were a product of the war. It annexed the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as well as parts of Finland, Poland, Romania, and a piece of former Czechoslovakia. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 can be seen as the unraveling of the empire it had built during and after the war. The borders we live with today were not determined by geography or ethnicity, but by the movement of armies and the decisions of a few powerful men in the final months of a global war. But what if the leaders at Yalta had made different decisions? Could the Cold War have been avoided? How many of today's ethnic conflicts are the direct result of borders that were arbitrarily drawn by the victors of the war? And are the borders we see on the map today any more permanent than the ones from 1938? Number 3, why can 5 countries stop the whole world? The United Nations was born from the failure of its predecessor, the League of Nations. The League, created after the First World War, had been too weak to prevent the aggression that led to the Second. When the leaders of the Allied powers met during the war, at conferences in places like Dumbarton Oaks and San Francisco, they were determined to create a new international organization with more teeth. They wanted an organization that could actually keep the peace. The result was the United Nations, officially founded on October 24th, 1945. The UN's charter declared its noble purposes to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations among nations, and to promote human rights. It created a General Assembly where every member nation has a vote, like a world parliament. It created agencies to deal with issues like health, the WHO, and refugees, the UNSER. But the real power was concentrated in one small body, the Security Council. The Security Council was given the authority to impose economic sanctions and even to authorize military force to stop aggression. But there was a catch. The 5 major victorious powers of the war, the United States, the Soviet Union, now Russia, Great Britain, France, and China, gave themselves a special status. They became the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and they gave themselves the power of the veto. This means that any one of these 5 countries can block any substantive resolution, no matter how much support it has from other nations. This was a pragmatic, if cynical, decision. The founders of the UN knew that the organization could not work if the major powers were not on board. The veto was the price of their participation. It ensured that the UN could never take action against one of its most powerful members or their close allies. This structure, a direct reflection of the power dynamics of 1945, is still in place today, and it has defined the UN's successes and failures. The UN has had many successes. Its peacekeepers have helped to end conflicts in many countries. Its humanitarian agencies have provided food, medicine, and shelter to millions of people. But on the biggest security crises of our time, the Security Council is often paralyzed by the veto. During the Cold War, the US and the USSR used their vetoes to block actions against each other's interests. More recently, Russia has used its veto to protect the Syrian government from international condemnation, and the United States has used its veto to shield Israel from critical resolutions. The world has changed dramatically since 1945. Countries like Germany and Japan, the defeated powers of the war, are now major economic powers. Countries like India, Brazil, and South Africa have emerged as major regional leaders, but the structure of the Security Council remains frozen in time, a relic of the world that existed the moment the war ended. This has led to a growing crisis of legitimacy for the UN. Many nations feel that the Security Council is undemocratic and anachronistic. But changing it is nearly impossible because any change to the UN Charter would have to be approved by the 5 permanent members, and they are unlikely to vote to diminish their own power. So the next time you see a crisis in the world and wonder why the UN isn't doing something, the answer often lies in a decision made in 1945 to give 5 countries a special power, a power that continues to shape the limits of international cooperation. But what would the world look like if the UN had never been created? Has the veto prevented a third world war, or has it simply enabled powerful countries to get away with aggression? And is it possible to reform the Security Council, or is the UN doomed to become increasingly irrelevant in a world that no longer reflects the power structure of 1945? Number 2, are we still fighting the Cold War? The end of the Second World War should have been a moment of global unity. The major powers had come together to defeat a common enemy. But instead, the moment the shooting stopped, a new conflict began. It was a conflict fought not with hot wars between the major powers, but with proxy wars, espionage, propaganda, and an arms race. It was the Cold War, a 45-year global struggle between 2 superpowers with 2 irreconcilable ideologies, the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union. And this conflict was a direct and immediate consequence of how the Second World War ended. The seeds of the Cold War were sown in the final years of the war itself. As the Soviet Red Army pushed the German military back from the east, and the American and British forces pushed from the west, they were not just liberating territory, they were claiming it. When they met in the middle of Germany in 1945, it was not just a meeting of allies, but the creation of a new front line. The decisions made at wartime conferences like Yalta and Potsdam divided Europe into spheres of influence. Eastern Europe fell under the control of the Soviet Union, and Western Europe came under the American security umbrella. In a famous speech in 1946, Winston Churchill declared that an iron curtain had descended across the continent. The logic of the Cold War dominated global politics for the next 4 decades. It created a bipolar world where every country was forced to choose a side. It led to the creation of 2 massive military alliances, NATO, led by the US, and the Warsaw Pact, led by the USSR. It fueled a terrifying nuclear arms race that brought the world to the brink of annihilation, and it was fought through a series of bloody proxy wars in places like Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, where the superpowers backed opposing sides, leading to millions of deaths. The space race, the covert operations of the CIA and the KGB, the Red Scare in the United States all were products of this ideological struggle. The Cold War officially ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. For a brief period, it seemed like a new era of global cooperation was dawning. But the legacy of the Cold War is still with us. The NATO alliance created to contain the Soviet Union has expanded to include many former Warsaw Pact countries, a move that Russia sees as a major provocation. The current conflict in Ukraine is in many ways a direct result of this unresolved tension, a battle over the post-Cold War order in Europe. The institutions and mentalities of the Cold War also persist. The vast intelligence agencies, the military-industrial complex, the network of U.S. military bases around the world all are relics of that struggle. The political divisions in the United States, which often seem to revolve around accusations of socialism or a lack of patriotism, have deep roots in the anti-communist paranoia of the 1950s. The world may no longer be bipolar, but the great power competition between the United States, Russia, and now China is, in many ways, a continuation of the same geopolitical dynamics that were set in motion the day the Second World War ended. We are still living in the world that Yalta built. But was the Cold War an inevitable result of the war's end, or could it have been avoided with different leadership? How did the constant threat of nuclear war shape the psychology of the generations that grew up under it? And are we now entering a new Cold War, or is this something different and potentially even more dangerous? Number 1. Did it ever really end? The formal surrender documents were signed, the victory parades were held, but did the war ever truly end? Or did it just change its form, becoming a permanent low-level condition of our modern world? The war created a set of institutions, technologies, and psychological states that are still with us. It created a permanent crisis mentality. It taught us that the world is an inherently dangerous place, that threats can emerge suddenly, and that only constant vigilance and overwhelming military power can keep us safe. Think about the technology. The war gave us radar. Today, we use it to track weather and guide civilian aircraft, but it was developed to detect enemy bombers. The war gave us the foundations of GPS. The modern global positioning system is the direct descendant of navigation systems developed for ships and planes during the war. The war gave us synthetic, rubber, plastics, and countless other materials, all developed to solve wartime shortages. Our world is built from the technological scraps of that conflict. Think about the economy. The war created the military-industrial complex, a permanent fusion of government, military, and corporate power that Eisenhower warned us about. It created the global financial institutions of Bretton Woods. It established the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. The globalized, high-tech, military-driven economy we live in is the economy the war created. Think about our psychology. The war introduced the world to horrors on a scale that was previously unimaginable. The firebombing of cities like Dresden and Tokyo, the industrial-scale extermination camps, the atomic bomb. These events shattered old ideas about progress and human nature. They left a lasting trauma on the global psyche. The fear of apocalypse, the anxiety about hidden threats, the sense that civilization is a fragile thing. These are all part of the war's psychological inheritance. In a study published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, researchers found that the children of soldiers who experienced intense combat trauma were more likely to suffer from anxiety and other stress-related disorders, suggesting that the trauma of war can be passed down through generations. The war never ended because the problems it was fought over were never fully resolved. The conflict between democracy and authoritarianism is more intense now than at any time since the 1940s. The debates over nationalism, borders, and ethnic identity that fueled the war are still fueling conflicts around the world. The technologies of surveillance and propaganda that were honed during the war have now been perfected and are used by governments and corporations to monitor and influence us in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1945. We tell ourselves that we live in a time of peace, but it is a strange kind of peace, a peace maintained by nuclear deterrence, a peace that requires a permanent war footing. We are living in the long armistice. The Second World War is not just a historical event, it is the operating system for the modern world. It is the ghost in our machine. But if the war never ended, what does that mean for our future? Are we doomed to repeat the same cycles of conflict, just with more advanced technology? Is it possible to finally end the war, to dismantle its institutions and heal its psychological wounds? Or is the state of permanent, technologically mediated conflict simply the new permanent condition of humanity? And what will the historians of the future call the long, strange war that began in 1939 and never really found its end?